What is happening right now in Washington does not look dramatic at first glance. There are no tanks on the streets, no emergency broadcasts, no sudden silence from the White House. On the surface, everything appears procedural, almost routine. A vote, documents, statements, denials. But this is exactly how the most dangerous political moments usually begin. Quietly, formally, wrapped in legal language that hides the scale of what is unfolding. And this is where the main thing begins. For only the third time in American history, a sitting president has crossed the impeachment threshold. Not symbolically, not hypothetically, formally. The House has approved charges. The machinery has been set in motion. Donald Trump, as expected, has rejected everything. He calls it a witch hunt, a political ambush, an act of desperation by his enemies. And in isolation, that reaction is predictable. He has never conceded wrongdoing, never retreated under pressure, never stepped aside voluntarily. That part of the story surprises no one. The part that does not fit the usual script is elsewhere. It is not in Trump's response, but in the response to him. Because behind the noise, something far more serious is taking shape. A growing number of lawmakers are no longer speaking in euphemisms. They are not asking for investigations. They are not waiting for reports. They are saying one thing openly on the record. He must go, now. Over 100 members of Congress have formally demanded the president's resignation. Not as a long-term aspiration, not after an election. Immediately, that number matters. This is not a fringe protest. This is not a symbolic gesture. It represents a massive, organized bloc within the legislature declaring that the sitting president is incompatible with continued governance. And once that line is crossed, the system enters unfamiliar territory. This is no longer just about impeachment articles sitting in drawers. Multiple resolutions have already been filed, written, logged, numbered. They are not theoretical documents. They are active instruments waiting for a shift in political control. And alongside them, something even more extraordinary is happening. Lawmakers are openly discussing the 25th Amendment, not as a thought experiment, not as a historical footnote, as a live option. The constitutional mechanism designed for incapacity is now being mentioned in the same breath as the president's name. That alone signals how deep the rupture has become. Congress is not merely divided, it is overheated. Every pressure point is active at once. Resignation demands, impeachment filings, constitutional removal pathways. None of these are happening in sequence. They are colliding simultaneously. And that raises the obvious question: what pushed the system this far, this fast? The trigger was not rhetorical, it was operational. A sudden military action abroad, launched without prior congressional authorization. Airstrikes, detentions, regime change language, and one critical detail that cannot be smoothed over. Congress was bypassed entirely. Article 1 of the Constitution assigns the power to declare war to the legislative branch. That line is not ambiguous. By ignoring it, the president unified his opposition in a way that speeches never could. Lawmakers who had previously urged caution are now changing tone. Even those known for restraint are saying the same thing. If military force is necessary, Congress must decide. Not after the fact. Not through press statements. Before lives and resources are committed. By acting first and explaining later, the president handed his critics exactly what they needed. A clean constitutional fault line. And then came Minneapolis. A single death. A federal agent. A civilian street. What began as a local incident rapidly transformed into a national rupture. Protests, closures, National Guard alerts, anger spreading far beyond one city. The death was no longer treated as an isolated tragedy. It was woven into a larger narrative. A pattern, they say. A presidency that treats legal constraints as optional both abroad and at home. This is how the argument is being constructed. If the executive branch feels unconstrained in foreign military action, it will eventually feel unconstrained in domestic enforcement. If constitutional limits can be ignored overseas, they will be ignored on American streets. Venezuela and Minneapolis are being fused into a single accusation, not incompetence, not misjudgment, tyranny. And that word is being used deliberately, not rhetorically, legally. It appears in the language of the resolutions themselves. This is not about policy disagreement anymore. It is about compatibility with the constitutional order. That framing changes everything, because once a president is described not as mistaken, but as fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance, the question stops being whether he should finish his term. It becomes whether the system can function while he remains. Trump's response to all of this has been absolute defiance. No apology, no concession, no acknowledgement of error. Instead, he is issuing warnings to his own party. Hold the House or I fall. He understands the arithmetic. As long as his party controls the chamber, these resolutions stall. The moment that control is lost, they activate instantly. This is why he is framing upcoming elections not as political contests, but as survival battles. And here is where the standoff hardens. Right now, the lawmakers demanding resignation do not yet have the procedural power to force removal, but they are documenting everything, laying groundwork, pre-staging the legal architecture. This is pressure, not execution. Yet. And everyone involved knows the difference. Public sentiment is shifting underneath this fight. Certain voter blocs are breaking sharply. Disapproval of domestic enforcement tactics is spiking. Communities that decide elections are reacting not to rhetoric, but to atmosphere, to fear, to instability. These numbers are not just polling data, they are permission structures. They give lawmakers the cover to take positions that would have been unthinkable months ago. Behind closed doors, the economic effects are beginning to register. Market volatility is climbing. Small businesses are pulling back. Budget deadlines are approaching. Funding battles are looming. And this is where pressure migrates from the abstract to the mechanical. Budgets, courts, enforcement, these are not symbolic arenas. They produce consequences whether anyone wants them to or not. So this is where things stand. A president who refuses to yield. A Congress that has stopped asking and started documenting. Constitutional mechanisms being spoken aloud that were once unmentionable. Military action without authorization. Domestic unrest with federal fingerprints, and an approaching budget deadline that could turn principle into leverage. It looks like a collection of separate crises. Until you put it all together, and when you do, a single pattern emerges. The system is no longer arguing about policy. It is testing its own limits, and the next move does not belong to speeches or press conferences. It belongs to math, votes, deadlines, and decisions that cannot be undone once they are made. From that point forward, the conflict stops being theoretical and becomes mechanical. Because once the language of tyranny is written into official documents, the system is no longer debating intent. It is building a record. Every refusal, every bypass, every reallocation of authority becomes a data point. And this is where the dynamic shifts in a way most people miss. The impeachment resolutions sitting idle right now are not dead. They are dormant. They exist in a state of suspension, waiting for a single variable to change. Control of the House. Nothing more, nothing less. The moment that balance flips, these documents do not need to be drafted, debated, or negotiated. They are already written, already numbered, already structured. They move instantly from accusation to action. That is why timing has become everything. The president understands this better than anyone, which is why his strategy is no longer persuasion. It is containment. Hold the partisan wall. Keep it intact at all costs. Because this is not about convincing the opposition. That door is closed. This is about preventing defections within his own ranks. Even a small fracture changes the equation, and the quiet truth is that cracks are already being monitored. Privately, constantly. The discussion around the 25th Amendment is a signal, not a plan. It is unlikely to be invoked. Everyone involved knows how extreme that mechanism is. But its presence in mainstream congressional language matters because it normalizes the idea that removal does not have to wait for elections or convictions. It reframes the presidency not as an untouchable office, but as a conditional one. That psychological shift alone alters the behavior of institutions. What makes this moment especially volatile is that multiple pressure channels are now reinforcing each other. Legal exposure feeds political pressure feeds economic anxiety feeds electoral fear, and electoral fear feeds legislative aggression. This feedback loop did not exist in earlier standoffs. It does now. Take the budget. Funding deadlines are not symbolic. When money expires, the government does not argue. It stops. Lawmakers threatening to tie enforcement funding to accountability are not posturing. They are targeting the one area where defiance has consequences regardless of rhetoric. The power of the purse does not require moral consensus. It requires votes. And this is where accusations of executive overreach become operational weapons. The internal reallocation of emergency funds only deepens that conflict. Redirecting billions without legislative approval is being framed not as crisis management, but as proof of the very charge being leveled. Usurpation. When lawmakers say the president is bypassing Congress, and then he bypasses Congress to fund enforcement agencies, the narrative reinforces itself. Each move strengthens the case against him rather than weakening it. The military dimension adds another layer of instability. When senior officers begin quietly seeking clarification on their obligations under competing authorities, the chain of command is no longer clean. No one is refusing orders. But the mere act of asking the question exposes uncertainty at the highest level. And uncertainty inside the national security apparatus is something markets, allies, and adversaries all respond to immediately. That reaction is already visible. Volatility is rising not because investors fear a single policy outcome, but because they fear paralysis. Prolonged constitutional standoffs erode confidence faster than almost any other political event. Credit risk increases. Long-term planning freezes. Ordinary economic activity slows as people wait for clarity that never quite arrives. And beneath all of this, there is the human layer that keeps being pulled back into focus. Minneapolis was not just a flashpoint. It became a symbol, a way to translate abstract constitutional arguments into lived consequences. The claim being made is simple and dangerous. If power feels unrestrained at the top, restraint erodes everywhere else. Abroad first, then at home. This is why the resignation demands are not receding. They are hardening. Lawmakers making them are not acting as if this will resolve quietly. Many of them represent politically fragile districts. They are not protected by safe margins. They are betting that their voters care more about constitutional order than partisan loyalty. That is a high-risk wager, and people do not make those bets unless they believe the ground has already shifted. The geographic spread of this movement matters as well. It is not confined to predictable regions. It cuts across states, cultures, and political histories. That dispersion is what gives it durability. It is harder to isolate, harder to dismiss as regional outrage, harder to neutralize with targeted messaging. What emerges from all of this is not a clean resolution, but a slow tightening. A presidency that can still act, but with shrinking legitimacy. A legislature that cannot yet remove, but can obstruct, document, and prepare. Institutions watching each other with increasing suspicion. Everyone waiting for the next lever to move. And this is the most dangerous phase. Not collapse, not removal, suspension. A system running at full speed with no shared agreement about its boundaries. History shows that something always breaks that suspension. Sometimes it is an election, sometimes a court ruling, sometimes an economic shock, sometimes an internal defection that changes the math overnight. The only certainty is that this is no longer a temporary flare-up. It is a structural confrontation, one that will define not just a presidency, but the limits of executive power itself. Whether the system bends, cracks, or holds will depend on decisions that are being prepared quietly, far from microphones. And once those decisions are triggered, there will be no rewind.